What actual crimes could Sean Diddy Combs be charged with? Based on the allegations from the lawsuits and updates in the raids of his homes, we are going to break down what potential federal charges the rapper and entertainment mogul could face. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. We're going to do something a little bit different for you right now. Now, let me preface this by saying what I'm about to go through is very speculative, okay? Let me be very, very, very clear about that. However, we are all waiting right now to see if federal prosecutors indict Sean Diddy Combs, the rapper, the producer, the music mogul. This comes after federal authorities, more specifically Homeland Security agents, raided Combs' two properties out in Miami and L.A. This is reportedly pursuant to an ongoing investigation from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Reports indicate that this centers around sex trafficking, which we're going to discuss a little bit more in a minute. But we don't know what federal investigators are actually looking for. We don't know for sure Combs' connection to all this. And of course, Combs has not been arrested or criminally charged at the time of this recording. However, based upon the allegations in the lawsuits that were filed against Combs in the past several months, which may have prompted or fueled this criminal investigation, and based on what sources are saying regarding the raids and what was collected from the homes, this is going to be my best guess so far at what potential charges prosecutors may be considering. And I'm only going to focus on federal charges since it seems the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York is spearheading this case. This is the feds. So first, let's talk about what seems to be very obvious potential charges: sex trafficking. Now, there are a few statutes that could come into play here. We have 18 U.S.C. Section 1591, sex trafficking of children or by force, fraud, or coercion. So this is when someone knowingly, meaning consciously, they understand what they're doing here, when someone knowingly, through interstate or foreign commerce, usually that means crossing state lines, recruits, entices, harbors, transports, provides, obtains, advertises, maintains, patronizes, or solicits by any means a person for the purposes of commercial sex, or if the defendant benefits from this too. And Commercial Sex Act is when you give something of value in exchange for a sex act, usually through force or threats or fraud or coercion. And of course, this statute includes if the person being trafficked is a minor. Now, if the victim was under the age of 14 or a fraud, force, or coercion were used, the penalty is not less than 15 years in prison up to life. If the victim was 14 to 17, the penalty is 10 years to life. And if anybody obstructs or attempts to obstruct the enforcement of this law, they face up to 20 years in prison. And defendants who are convicted under this law, they're required to pay restitution to their victims as well. By the way, Jeffrey Epstein was charged with this crime before he died. Just keep that in mind. Now, if we assume that Cassandra Ventura, who's Combs' ex, she had filed a lawsuit against Combs, settled with him the day after filing it, but she alleged some heinous acts, said that she was a victim of sexual abuse, physical abuse, really nasty things. But it's now being reported by TMZ that she is cooperating with federal authorities, that she has been working with them for several weeks, even before the raids on Combs' properties. So if she is one of the victims or alleged victims in this criminal case, then her allegations could constitute sex trafficking. So we always wondered if she was cooperating, and if she is, that would be a monumental piece of evidence for the prosecution. And by the way, just generally speaking, we were always wondering who might be cooperating with the feds, whether the plaintiffs in the multiple lawsuits that Combs is facing were the witnesses that provided the feds with probable cause to get the search warrants for Diddy's properties. But yes, taking her allegations as true in her original complaint, what she alleges could constitute sex trafficking. In fact, she cites this statute in her lawsuit. The allegation is that Combs forced her to engage in sex acts across multiple jurisdictions while she was an artist signed with Bad Boy Records, that she was held captive to Combs' demands and desires, that she actually wasn't even allowed to leave at one point, and that Combs' companies and affiliated businesses perpetuated this sex trafficking by Combs to keep him happy. And remember the allegations that Combs supplied her with drugs and alcohol, had sex with her, beat her, and more specifically, forced her to engage in freak-offs. That's where she was compelled to perform sex acts with other men, including sex workers, while Combs watched, pleasured himself, even videotaped the encounters, all over a period of time in multiple locations: New York, Miami, Atlanta, Los Angeles. And then Combs would then pay for trips for Ventura, bought her lavish gifts, rented her an apartment. So that's the value component of the sex trafficking. And that is what she was given in exchange. That's what makes these commercial sex acts, that she was under his employ, that she was getting things of value from him. And this statute seems like it would also apply to the allegations made by a Jane Doe in another lawsuit against Diddy, because she claims that when she was 17 years old, she was gang raped and trafficked by Sean Combs, bad boy President Harvey Pierre, and a third person. The allegation was that she was flown from Michigan to New York City on Combs's private jet, remember, crossing state lines, sex trafficking, that she was plied with drugs and alcohol, and that she was sexually assaulted by Pierre and gang raped by all three people at Combs's New York recording studio. Then let's say Rodney Jones is also an alleged victim in this criminal case. Remember, he alleges, he's a former producer of Combs, he alleges in his suit that Combs, his son, various associates and businesses forced him into sex trafficking too. Jones alleges that Combs would touch him, grope him, his private areas, that Combs would set up a situation where actor Cuba Gooding Jr. sexually assaulted him on his yacht. But even more specific to sex trafficking, Jones alleges that Combs forced him to solicit and engage in sex with sex workers, even claims that Combs drugged him at one point. And this was all while he was being transported by Combs to New York, Florida, the Virgin Islands. And throughout the complaint, he alleges that Combs threatened him to do these things too. In terms of the commercial aspect, Jones alleges that all the while this was going on, all the while he was being assaulted and trafficked, Combs was promising him things of value: money, Grammy Awards, access to future projects, a multi-million-dollar home, threatening to not pay him. Now, before I go any further, let me just say one little caveat here. These are all allegations in civil lawsuits, okay? The burden of proof is lower in a civil case than in a criminal case, okay? So these are civil allegations. However, you can have events that overlap. You can have events that can subject you to both civil and criminal liability. So what he is alleging here are, in essence, criminal acts. It'll be up to prosecutors to see if the evidence is sufficient to warrant charges. But again, we are surmising what potential charges Diddy could face. Now, let me also say this. I just laid out examples from these lawsuits that could constitute sex trafficking, but we don't know who else prosecutors may be speaking to or who else could be potential victims that experience similar alleged treatment. But we are talking potentially multiple counts of sex trafficking, or maybe even one large count that includes multiple victims. And it is also my understanding that there is no statute of limitations on federal sex trafficking. Now, keeping all this in mind, I want to bring up some other potential criminal statutes as we talk about sex workers specifically. So there is 18 USC 2421A. Combs could be charged with this if he knowingly transported someone across state lines for the purposes of prostitution or illegal sex act. My understanding, that carries a punishment of up to 10 years in prison. You couple that with 18 USC 2422B, if Combs knowingly persuaded, induced, enticed, or coerced someone across state lines for the purposes of prostitution or illegal sex acts, my understanding is that it could be up to 20 years in prison. I say all of this because if it is true that he had prostitutes at these parties and in his orbit, look, I don't know how they got there, where they were transported from, or how, but this is something that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about illegal sex work. But going back for a second, I was talking about sex trafficking of adults for the most part, but also taking the allegations in Jones's suit as true, it is possible Diddy could be brought up on sex trafficking charges with respect to minors as well. Now, I already mentioned 18 USC 1591, but there's also 18 USC 2251, sexual exploitation of a child. Combs could be brought up on this charge if he employed, used, persuaded, induced, enticed, or coerced a minor to engage in any sexually explicit conduct that was filmed and broadcast. The reason I bring this up is there are already allegations that Diddy filmed sexual encounters and had cameras in his home that filmed everything that was going on. And Jones alleges that Diddy had parties with sex workers and minors. So now you're talking about potentially 15 to 30 years in prison. That's my understanding of that. There is also 18 U.S.C. Section 2422B, which makes it a crime to induce or attempt to induce a minor to engage in prostitution or illegal sex acts, like having sex with an adult. My understanding that is up to 10 years in prison. And then you have to bring up another statute. Again, taking these allegations as true that Combs used threats of violence and actual violence to get people to do stuff for him. I mean, Cassandra Ventura says he savagely beat her. Jones says he was threatened both directly and indirectly by Combs. I mean, he says Combs alleged to eat his face and that he would kill his own mother to get what he wanted. So you have to call out 18 U.S.C. 1589. That makes forced labor a crime. Getting someone to work for you through force, threats, physical restraint, that carries, my understanding, up to 20 years in prison. So when we hear about these allegations about the power and influence of Diddy, his wealth, his team, his associates, this untouchable aspect, that is what is key here. Now, let's also talk about racketeering. This is another potential crime that prosecutors may be thinking about. And it was referenced in the Jones suit. I think it could apply if we think the worst. Take these allegations as true. So racketeering, or RICO, it's about organized crime, a criminal enterprise or organization, and it spans several different sections of the federal criminal code. 18 U.S.C. 1961 defines racketeering activity as, quote, any act or threat involving murder, kidnapping, gambling, arson, robbery, bribery, extortion, dealing in obscene matter, or dealing in a controlled substance or listed chemical, which is chargeable under state law, punishable by prison. It's a serious crime. So first, as even emphasized by Rodney Jones in his lawsuit, the obscene matter and controlled substances could be potential flags here or apply to Diddy. The idea of a pattern of illegal sex acts and drug possession and distribution. Jones specifically mentions the acquisition, use, and distribution of ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, marijuana, mushrooms. Also, there was an allegation in the Ventura lawsuit that Combs blew up rapper Kid Cudi's car because he was maybe romantically interested in Ventura. It could be one of those underlying acts. It could also be an overt act as part of a conspiracy. I'm going to explain that in a bit. But racketeering can also be any act which is indictable under any of the following provisions of Title 18 U.S.C. Again, the federal code. Let me list out a few that could potentially be used by prosecutors. Section 933 relating to trafficking in firearms. Many allegations of firearms possession and shootings that Combs was involved in these lawsuits. And it was reported that firearms were retrieved from Combs's properties during those raids. Not clear who they were registered to, if at all, and if they belonged to Combs or his security. There's Section 1341 relating to mail fraud, Section 1343 relating to wire fraud. I'm going to highlight these because Jones said Combs and his companies deliberately and fraudulently induced Jones and others like him to work without getting paid for their work. There is also Section 1511 relating to obstruction. That could be related to allegations that Combs covered up his involvement in violent episodes, including shootings at a recording studio in 2022 and the infamous 1999 nightclub shooting involving his ex, J-Lo. Then there's racketeering that could be acts, Section 1581 to 1592. This is about slavery and trafficking in persons. We already discussed that. There's Section 1956 that relates to money laundering. Yes, Jones alleges that Combs and his companies engaged in money laundering. Section 1962 makes it illegal to financially benefit from racketeering activity. So the allegation here would be that Combs and his businesses, they're making music, they're earning money, they're getting rich off of the labor of these musicians and producers like Jones that they exploit. Another section of 1962 makes it illegal for any person to participate in the racketeering activity. So that could be how you get others potentially criminally charged. And that's actually what brings me to how they could charge Combs with RICO. It probably would be prosecuted as conspiracy to violate the RICO statute. Now, conspiracy is an agreement to break the law, and there must be overt acts or steps taken in furtherance of that conspiracy. Overt acts don't have to be crimes per se, nor do they even have to be events that are separately charged as crimes. I mean, look at the Young Thug trial that we're covering on the Law&Crime Network. Massive RICO case. They have listed 191 overt acts that prosecutors are trying to prove. Here, in this case, you could say shootings, brandishing weapons, threats, soliciting sex workers, blowing up Kid Cudi's car, all allegations. But you see what I'm saying. Give you an example of the criminal enterprise as part of potential RICO charges. In Jones's complaint, it states that the purpose of the Combs enterprise is to use its position, power, and influence to control all of these people, promoting and enhancing their prestige and reputation. of all the people involved, preserving, protecting the power, territory, and criminal ventures of the enterprise. And he goes on to say that it keeps victims in fear of the enterprise and its members and associates, which leads me to believe that Combs wouldn't be charged alone. Then again, you could charge him and identify others as unidentified co-conspirators. But generally speaking, when we talk about racketeering crimes, we're looking at potentially 5 to 20 years in prison. Let me end this real quick by talking out about firearms and drug possession charges. So Rodney Jones claims in his lawsuit that members and associates of the Combs Rico enterprise engaged in drug trafficking and firearms trafficking. There are whole sections of the U.S. Code dedicated to this. Now, we don't know what kinds of weapons were recovered from Combs's properties, but if he had firearms with serial numbers scratched off, or machine guns, or in some cases, certain kinds of rifles or silencers, he could be in violation of 18 U.S.C. 922. Then, if it turns out that he possessed firearms and he's an unlawful user or drug addict, he could be in violation of another section of 18 U.S.C. 922. Also, it is illegal under federal law to use a firearm in drug trafficking or violent crimes, which again is what Jones alleges. Again, Jones alleges that Combs and his crew required those around him and those to be employed to transport unregistered firearms and to purchase and distribute narcotics. Speaking of which, Combs could also face federal drug charges. It is illegal to distribute controlled substances. The penalties vary depending on the quantity and type of the narcotics, but 21 U.S.C. 844 makes mere possession of controlled substances a crime as well. And you can argue that if drugs are found in his home, that could be constructive possession. And with respect to Combs or someone else, let me also say 18 U.S.C. 2 makes it a crime to aid, abet, counsel, command, induce, or procure the commission of a crime. So even if he or his associates don't have to personally commit the crime, they can still be charged if they participated in some way. With all that, that is just an overview of what I was thinking in terms of what federal prosecutors may be considering. This, again, all speculation based on allegations and reporting, but we shall see. All right, everybody, that is all we have for you right now here on this episode of Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.